Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Whitman School's webinar on business in Asia. My name is Q Lee, Associate Dean for Global Initiatives and Professor of Marketing at the Whitman School. I'm glad to be your host today. Now, with Asia's significant clout in the global economy and the dynamic geopolitical developments between US and major players in Asia, and on top of that, also the added layer of challenges and uncertainties brought by the COVID-19 pandemic during the last few years, we are here to discuss some really critical factors and trends that will shape the future of global economy in a major way. And for this reason, I'm extremely excited to have an unusually high-powered panel of three experts on Asian business. We will greatly benefit from hearing from the panelists' unique perspectives and expertise. And we'll also have a time for Q&A during the latter part of this webinar. So at any time, if you have any questions, feel free to type up your questions to the Q&A box that you will see on the screen. And I will try to address as many of them as the time allows. Okay, so without further ado, let me now introduce our panelists. First, let me introduce my colleague, Professor Ravi Darwadkar. Professor Darwadkar is the Whitman Advisory Council Professor of Management and the Laura J. and L. Douglas Meredith Professor of Teaching Excellence at Syracuse University's Whitman School. He also serves as the chair of the management department. And Professor Darwadkar is a recipient of numerous awards for his distinguished accomplishments both in teaching and research, including Poets and Quants 2017 Top 40 Undergraduate Professor recognition. Now, Dr. Darwadkar is a renowned leading scholar with expertise on corporate governance, corporate strategy, and international business. Has published his research in numerous top academic journals while also holding editorial positions for leading journals. Dr. Darwadkar teaches at Whitman School courses in international business, organizational theory, and strategy, and has played leading roles in Syracuse University's international strategy. Professor Darwadkar received his bachelor's degree from St. Xavier's College in Mumbai, India, and his MBA from XLRI in India, and his PhD degree is from University of Cincinnati. So Ravi, thank you for joining us. The second panelist is Mr. Bart Adis. Bart Adis is Distinguished Fellow, Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, and Professor of Practice at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. He is a famous policy analyst, commentator, and author of the book entitled Learning from Tomorrow, Using Strategic Foresight to Prepare for the Next Big Disruption. He's an expert on developing Asian economies, international development, cross-border trade and investment, innovation, social policies, and transformative trends in reshaping the world. Now, in the 1990s, he led communications for a Paris-based EU-OECD joint initiative supporting public administration reform in Central and Eastern Europe. And between 2001 and 2020, Adis held various senior staff positions at the Asian Development Bank, ADB, including his leadership role in ADB's Manila headquarters, where he provided policy leadership, strategic leadership, and operational guidance on a wide range of economic, social, technological, and policy issues. He also led ADB's landmark public communications policy and work on the impact of climate change on migration in Asia. And most recently, he served as ADB's North American representative in Washington, D.C. Since December 2020, he has served as a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and was also named a distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada in January 2021. He received his bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and master's degree in public policy from the University of Michigan's Gerald Ford School of Public Policy. Thank you, Bart, for joining us. And the third panelist is also a colleague at Syracuse University. Chris Patel is the Donald P. and Margaret Curry Gregg Professor of Practice in Korean and East Asian Affairs at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs of Syracuse University. In this role, she teaches courses in policy studies, public administration, and international affairs, while also doing research in Maxwell's program for the advancement of research on conflict and collaboration, and contributing to Syracuse University's Intelligence Center community of academic excellence. Now, as an alumna of Syracuse University, Professor Patel came back to Syracuse with extensive first-hand experience building and leading intelligence and research analytics programs within a national and international context. Over her 25-year career, she has developed and managed numerous large teams on intelligence analytics and network analysis with a focus on a wide spectrum of financial crime and national security risks. Now, Professor Patel most recently served as a regional head of research and analytics in Asia Pacific for HSBC. And prior to HSBC, she also served as the Deputy Director of Intelligence at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in the US Department of Treasury. She has also served in a variety of senior management roles in Asia and Washington, DC, as the Director of National Intelligence Open Source Center, Seoul Bureau Chief, and also other leadership roles over initiatives related to counterterrorism and proliferation issues. So Chris, thank you for joining us. All right, so I'm a marketing professor, but these three panelists all come from kind of different background and different expertise. And let me open up by asking each of the panelists about their unique perspectives in terms of what has really caught your attention. What was the most significant trend or development in the business world of Asia that has captured your attention the most during the last 12 to 18 months? So why don't I start with Professor Dawatkar. Ravi, what would be the one that caught your attention the most?
Well, thank you, Q, and thanks to Bart and Chris for joining us today. So again, Asia is a big continent. Lots of things are happening out there. And to understand what's happened in the last couple of years, we have to go look back nearly 2,000 odd years, right? So here's sort of the brief 2-minute summary of economic history over the last couple of thousand of years. So if you look back historically, Asia always has been the dominant economic continent. And right from, let's say, the Roman era, there always has been a trade surplus for Asia with respect to Western countries. And this has sort of continued. This Asian preeminence in terms of nominal GDP continued for quite a many years, all the way up till 1820s. Okay. And it's only about in the 1870s that you see that Europe and its counterpart, the Western offshoots, start becoming more economically dominant. So there's this notion that a divergence takes place. Part of it is driven internally because of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and so on and so forth. But the other part is colonialism, which probably makes a big difference to people from Asia. And here I'd like to sort of put in a quote by a very famous philosopher, George Santayana, who says, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think Asians take this quite seriously because the colonial era had huge implications for how Asians react to the world today. So it's only about 1870, the Western or European dominance of the economic system and global GDP comes to aid. And that's around the time my grandfather was born. So you're not looking at lots of generations. In my case, it's only 3 generations, right? So this sort of divergence keeps going on. And by the time I'm born in about 1968, Asia has hit rock bottom. And a classic sort of book that captures this is the famous Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal wrote a book called The Asian Dilemma, Inquiry into the Poverty of Nations, right? So this is a take on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So by 1868, things look really bad. What happened since then is really amazing, beginning with Japan, and then with, of course, the other Eastern Asian countries, and then China and India. Asia has reemerged. And it's in this context that a lot of things have changed. And this reemergence has taken place rather quickly. And this has surprised perhaps folks in the West. And by about 2003, that's in the last couple of decades, you can see that there's been some parity between Asia in terms of its GDP vis-a-vis the EU, vis-a-vis the US. And so this has caused a lot of change in terms of how the world perceives Asia and relationships within Asia too. So it's not that it's a homogeneous continent, it's a vast continent with lots of fault lines. So coming to current times, the thing that's of great interest to business folks at, let's say, Whitman and in the business world is this newly emergent fault line that seems to be re-emerging in terms of the issues between the US and China. And it's very common. It's in the newspapers all the time. It's the Wall Street Journal today. And that's taking center stage out right now. So the re-emergence of China has created a lot of issues. And two things that hopefully we can touch on as we go forward is, one, the notion of decoupling. That's very commonly being heard out there in the press. And second, again, there's a Chinese strategy called dual circulation. So as far as the business world is concerned, the reemergence of Asia, the fractures therein, have created these two sort of policy orientations, one, decoupling, and second, dual circulation. And businesses have to sort of navigate through both these challenges. And hopefully, maybe as we go through, Chris and Bart can add to how businesses navigate these two challenges strategically and operationally going forward. So that's where we are. A continent that was written off by 1968 has reemerged rather rapidly, and it's created lots of new fault lines that didn't exist before.
Well, thank you. I don't know who else can really summarize the history of 2,000 years within such a short period of time with clarity. So thank you. Let me go to Bart. So when you think about, please not the last 2,000 years, but now, if you think about the last 12 to 18 months, what are some of the important trends that caught your attention from that world of business in Asia?
Hugh, the thing that comes to mind is the thing that's still with us, and that is COVID-19. So this caused not just in North America, where we're all residing, but in Asia as well, massive disruptions in every aspect of life in every sector, and focusing on business and the economy. All of these countries in Asia were very hard hit. The Asian Development Bank estimated that some 80 million people in developing Asia were thrust into extreme poverty. Small businesses, entrepreneurs were put out of work or struggled to survive commercially. And of course, there has been some progress, and actually the bounce back has been quite impressive, particularly with regard to exports, which surged past their pre-pandemic levels in the earlier part of this year, 2021. But these countries are still struggling with what COVID has left them. And a part of that is you still have a lot of restrictions in place, and you have low vaccination rates, particularly in, say, Central Asia, some countries in Southeast Asia, like Laos, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Some countries which seem to be doing very well at controlling spread of COVID, Vietnam, China, Australia. There was a lot of international spotlight on these countries because they had, it was perceived that they had done very well in controlling the virus, but then Delta came along and you had more outbreaks, which led to more quarantines and their continuing travel restrictions. And for some countries that rely on tourism for a lot of their hard currency earnings. Their economies blasted out of the water. In the Pacific Islands in particular, they are struggling still. Countries, Thailand, I think of Bali in Indonesia, Philippines, Maldives, very hard hit. And that sector is only going to come back slowly. So this is what I see still influencing the course of events in Asia. Obviously, supply chains have been profoundly disrupted. There is silver lining, which we'll get to, but you were talking about like the last 12 to 18 months, it's been about COVID. There is light at the end of the tunnel. I mentioned, for example, trade bouncing back in some, depending on where you are in Asia, things could seem almost normal again. So I'm cautiously optimistic. Keep in mind that, for example, in Southeast Asia, in the countries of ASEAN, the 5 largest developing countries in Southeast Asia between 2010 and 2019, they were growing at an annual rate of 5% a year, which is incredible compared to, say, more developed countries in the West. And obviously COVID threw that off track, but I see after COVID that growth renewing. So there's some reason for optimism. But again, COVID remains a risk going into 2022 for the economies and for the business climate.
Thank you. How about you, Chris? From your vantage point, what have you noticed?
So I've been largely focused on the rapid changes in the financial industry and specifically how these developments are playing out in the compliance space. So from my optic, the most significant trend in the business world is how China and ASEAN countries are really driving the transformation of the financial industry. Specifically the rise of tech companies' involvement in digital banking services in Asia and what that means for underbanked and unbanked populations there. The slow erosion of Hong Kong is one of the world's international financial centers, and China's push to change international rules and standards and the international governance structure for the financial industry to suit its foreign policy goals. So specifically, if in addition to central bank digital currency developments in Singapore and China, we are seeing app providers such as Indonesia's GoTo and Grab, which we don't have an equivalent in the United States. They're really expanding services and engaging in digital experimentation, particularly for segments of countries' populations that do not currently have access to the banking sector. So to put this in context, half of Southeast Asia's 400 million adults do not have a banking account, and more than 90 million are underbanked. So small and medium-sized businesses cannot get funding through banks, so they can't grow. And the smartphone really is changing how these populations use the financial sector. And now that individuals and small and medium-sized businesses can access services that allow them to purchase goods, invest, transfer funds, and get loans, we're going to see an explosion, I think, of growth in that area that hasn't been an opportunity for a lot of these individuals and companies before. And a lot of what they're doing is incredibly innovative. Turning to China and Hong Kong, the last 3 years have been incredibly tough for companies and banks and individuals in Hong Kong. And I know we're going to talk about that later, so I'm not going to get into it. But just talking about China and one of the kind of the big developments that have been going on that really hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but it's a major transformation for the way the financial industry actually operates in the future, is that China has been pushing or sometimes leading efforts by international financial standards organizations to change the way we do standards and what those standards are to suit China. So before, it was kind of led a lot by Western countries, but now over the last 5 years, China has been pushing international standards making, and it is really going to be transforming how banks operate. So a good example of this is China's recent activities with SWIFT. So SWIFT is basically the cabling system that messages go through for banks, and setting those standards and what information is going to occur in those those transactions. Chinese intentions have been very clear about this. There are ample number of Chinese government documents from 2019, April 2021, that talk about how China not only wants to be an economic power, but it wants to alter existing norms, international norms, and global governance to suit its broader vision. So it wants to transform how, from a bureaucracy perspective, how companies operate to suit what China wants. In addition to that, we're also seeing a real push by Chairman Xi and the Chinese Communist Party amping up attacks on civil society and really being much more assertive in foreign countries, in Asian countries, in Australia. There's been a lot in the press about this in Australia over the last couple of years in terms of coercive economic measures. So China's push forward to be more assertive is really having an impact on Asia and Asian business, both at the company level and then at the national level.
Thank you, Chris. And actually, that reminds me of a very significant event that was in the news just 2 days ago. That is the virtual meeting between President Joe Biden and China's Xi Jinping. And that is just one significant event in a series of very turbulent and dynamic developments in the policy changes and so on. So, Chris, you just talked about some policy changes or developments on the China side. But Ravi, could you also tell us a little bit about maybe the U.S. foreign policy, especially towards Asia, because China is the second largest economy, but also that region includes 3 other top 10 economies in the world, including Japan and India and South Korea. So how do you think the U.S. Foreign policy changes are shaping the business environment there and the business relationship between Asia and U.S.?
Sure. So as far as the U.S. perception of China is concerned, I believe it has changed significantly over the last 2 decades. So if you just go back to, let's say, 2000, you can see that the U.S. Senate decided to vote 83-15 in favor of letting China join the World Trade Organization. There's a very positive perception of China at that point. And the hope was to bring China into the multilateral trading system, and eventually there might be some changes in China. Clearly, that did not happen. Okay, so over time, you can see the relationship that was meant to be collaborative has taken very competitive tones. So if you look at the State Department website, it says we view China as a competitor, right? So that's a big shift that's taken place in the last, let's say, 15 odd years. When did that shift take place? I suspect it was a financial crisis that didn't help what happened here. And China becomes a little more assertive after the financial crisis, saying, hey, your problems with your economic system, and perhaps that's not the best model everyone should follow, given what's going on. 3 other things happen over the same time. 3 different presidents decide to pivot to Asia, right? So the first president is George W. Bush. This is under the radar, where actually he signs a huge nuclear agreement with India. So until then, India had been sort of not very much in the U.S. radar. And that's a big step that George W. Bush takes. This is followed, of course, by the big pivot to Asia by President Obama. And subsequently, it ends in this new concept called the Indo-Pacific under the Trump administration. So there's a clear sort of consensus that China is a competitor, and other large Asian economies such as India, Japan, and South Korea are collaborators. In fact, Japan is a cornerstone of Asian policy as far as the US is concerned. Significant relationships with Korea over the last 100 years. And perhaps a new addition here is India over the last 2 decades. So that shift has taken place. And just as Chris mentioned, the most sort of recent big event that signifies the shift is the submarine deal between the US, Australia, and the UK. So you can see a lot of things are changing. Such things wouldn't have taken place about 20 odd years ago when there was much more of a collaborative spirit. So I think there's a change in the tone. And as Bart mentioned earlier, how does this affect business? I think COVID has hastened the move of decoupling. So I think there was a trend to decoupling, but because of COVID and implications of supply chains and all the disruptions that took place, I think there's a hastened sense that this has to be done rather quickly when it matters. Again, it's not in all industries, but in some strategic industries. And I think that's going to sort of move rather quickly in the next few years, in which there'll be much more restraints on businesses on what they can do and not do with China.
Okay, thank you. Now, Bart, can you kind of broaden the scope a little bit further then? So, Ravi just talked about the US, China, and then how that also impacted, the dynamics between China and India and so on. Now, if you broaden the scope a little bit, maybe including other regions of Asia and how other economies or countries are dealing with this changing dynamics geopolitically, what do you notice there?
Well, let's focus on Southeast Asia, which has gotten a little bit of attention so far in our discussion today. So the 10 countries that are members of ASEAN, I think this is where attention is going to be increasingly turning. Naturally, when you start talking about the U.S.-China relationship, that almost stops the conversation and sucks the oxygen out of the room. But I think it's important for policymakers and business leaders to look elsewhere in the region. And ASEAN is providing huge opportunities for American business and for engagement. And certainly the U.S. has recognized this from a strategic standpoint, and now is trying to step up economic engagement, even though it kind of missed the boat by pulling out of the TPP in 2017, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes 4 ASEAN members. But just to give you some feel for how important this sub-region is, we're talking over 600 million people, larger population than Canada, the EU, and the UK combined. It's estimated that ASEAN countries together could represent the largest or the 4th largest market in the world by 2030. Okay, so while we naturally focus on the big players in Asia or the traditional market economies that have done well, Korea and Japan, I think this collection of countries needs to be, and it's a very diverse collection, but close to 3/5 of the population is under 35. And one of the other trends you asked earlier about what did we see in the last 12 to 18 months, besides COVID and its impacts? Well, this trend toward automation and take up of technology, which Chris mentioned in the context of the finance sector, that's gone through all sectors. And you had some 40 million people get onto the internet in Southeast Asia in 2020 alone, boosting the numbers to some 400 million, about 70% of the subregion's population. Along with that, the development of new apps and e-commerce. In fact, e-commerce is expected to become a $1 trillion business in ASEAN by 2030. So I think that this is really a dynamic region. It's not just Singapore, which is, of course, a world leader in science and tech and in many other regards. It's also the middle income countries and Malaysia and Thailand and the heavyweight of Indonesia, which itself, if it regains its pre-pandemic growth path by 2030, could be the 7th largest economy, springboarding ahead of several European countries. So keep an eye on what's happening in ASEAN. And I think just a last note for the moment, the U.S. looking for ways to engage with Southeast Asia while constrained in the political environment of the U.S., where it's hard to negotiate trade deals, is now toying with the idea next year of announcing some big economic partnership with Asia, which I suspect would be centered around Southeast Asia. Keep an eye out for that as well. But there is this realization that it's not just on the security angle with an eye on China, but in terms of commerce, this can solidify important relationships across the Pacific and create huge opportunities for American business.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Now, another big subject that everybody's talking about these days is the global supply chain crisis. And I sincerely hope that Santa and his crew of reindeer will solve the problem, within 1 month from now. But the logistics part aside, it seems there's also some kind of interesting interaction between the global supply chain and also the finance and also some geopolitical issues that we have talked about. And I think, Chris, having served in that region and also working on this kind of financial sector side and having observed the policy changes in China, you might have some unique expertise and insights on it. So would you mind sharing that with us?
Sure. So, financial institutions and their corporate customers have to do adequate due diligence on the companies that are involved in their supply chain. So everything from foreign suppliers, agents, customers, distributors, third parties, and end users. The financial institutions have to kind of be across those companies to determine if there is something illegitimate going on. So are any of those firms involved in, let's say, forced labor or human trafficking or fraud? And what we've seen increasingly over the last 4 years or so is that it is becoming more difficult to actually do that work. So there's a greater risk and cost, frankly, for financial institutions and companies to be able to meet their compliance obligations. So when we talk about data privacy laws, for example, or corporate registries being shut down so that companies can't see them and they're not open like we see in Hong Kong, it's really difficult for people who are investigators or compliance specialists or, frankly, relationship managers who are trying to do business with customers in China, particularly, to be able to ascertain whether the companies that they're working with are involved in Section 301 tariff violations if it's going into the United States. There's this incredible reputational risk part of this discussion. And so, as we see more data restrictions, and we see particularly in Hong Kong, for example, where it's much more difficult today compared to a year and a half ago because of the national security law. And actually to do this business, we're going to actually see businesses might become more cautious. Remember, compliance is an overhead cost. So as the cost of doing this due diligence increases, it affects their bottom line. So either we're going to see a lot of companies ignoring doing this type of work, or they're going to shy away and not do business deals. And that's kind of the future. And whether you're an American company out of New York or a Singapore company or one out of London, it's just becoming riskier in some ways because of these restrictions. And it will affect the supply chain.
Okay. So now, if you kind of consider that increased risk, and Bart earlier talked about also that tremendous potential that especially Southeast Asia, the ASEAN kind of group of countries pose. This is just a question that any of you can address and answer, but do you see somehow maybe some major shift of the Western nations, especially in their business in Asia, kind of moving away from the China and Hong Kong and that base towards maybe other regions, perhaps Southeast Asia? Do you see kind of this playing a more favorable role for the Southeast Asian countries? What do you think?
I can start if that's okay. We're already seeing it, particularly, for example, in Hong Kong. There was recently HSBC split its CEO into Greater China and Asia, and they put Asia in Singapore. And if you use HSBC as a kind of a bellwether, they're splitting their business lines, and you're seeing this in numerous companies in Hong Kong, where the risk they're going to have to wall off Hong Kong and Greater China from the rest of Asia, which is costly actually, because they've built their business model in Hong Kong to span there's synergies between China and the rest of Asia. So, Singapore ultimately, at least from what we've seen in the last year or so, is the beneficiary of this greater investment, headquarters being moved, at least in the financial sector. Their Deutsche Bank, HSBC, and numerous other ones are now, their operations are moving out of Hong Kong to Singapore.
I would just add to that we saw in COVID times and before COVID times the U.S.-China trade relationship deteriorating, right? And so a lot of companies thinking about the manufacturing and where they were going to get their inputs, where they were going to import from, started to look at the risk factor of having factories or depending on factories in China. And so there was a diversification that continues to this day, particularly to Southeast Asia, to countries like Vietnam and Thailand, Philippines to an extent, in South Asia. So to kind of spread the risk. So there hasn't been a wholesale departure from China or an end to purchases. In fact, trade during the pandemic, Americans and Europe have been importing quite a lot when people were locked up in their houses and they were gaming and buying new tech equipment and TVs. This is all coming from Asia, in some cases from China. But the short story in terms of diversification, yes, it's happening. And you also have this trend within Asia, and this continues from before COVID, of intensifying regional cooperation and integration. And that gets into the discussion we can touch upon later about the trade agreements that have been approved in recent years.
Great. Thank you. I will address actually one question from the audience, and then it is, I think, related with some of the things that we've been talking about, especially risk factors coming from China and that region. Because we also hear a lot about the current situation with the Chinese junk bond market or the over-investment in the real estate. The yields surpassing 25% and the insolvency, and many real estate firms now facing a huge risks. From the panelists, this person in the audience would like to know how this will impact the broader economic and credit markets in China and around Asia. Any thoughts on that?
Let me take a crack at this. So I think one of the clear problems in the last few months that has become more apparent is the number of empty apartments and real estate issues in China. And some really big Chinese companies have been close to default. And somehow things have settled down. When these things happened in the past, in, let's say, Thailand or other countries, there were serious repercussions. But I suspect the scale and the reach of the Chinese government probably manages this transition a little better. So not much has happened in terms of defaults of these large companies, and they've sort of gone off the news. I don't see Evergrande in the news anymore, and they seem to have paid off with the last installment. So I have a feeling there's a lot more control of the centralized system there in managing these problems that perhaps other countries in Southeast Asia that Bart might know more about this, that went through the 1997 financial crisis through lots of different things. I don't see the same scale of problems here. So maybe Bart can add on that, given his experience in Southeast Asia.
I'd actually just stick with China, and I think your observations are spot on, Ravi. China has handled these major challenges, but it's also been kind of a diversion from other policy goals in this kind of financial turbulence and companies facing bankruptcy in real estate and elsewhere. We're seeing after an initial surge of the Chinese economy after recovering a bit from the pandemic, it's slowed down a little bit. So it's still growing, but not as fast as was foreseen earlier this year. And this matters to the rest of the world. China as a leading engine of growth and helping us, carry through into 2022 and beyond and get through the remnants of this pandemic. It's when they're dealing with a variety of messes, and also undertaking some moves like crackdown on tech, even when it costs the Chinese economy. It's making people a little bit nervous, and the foreign business community is watching with some concern of what's next. So there's the cloud of uncertainty over China is growing. You see in the tech space, for example, companies like LinkedIn and Yahoo and Epic Games pulling out the new regulations on privacy, intense censorship, and other measures are making companies nervous. And while it's still a massive market that will attract business, a lot of big firms are wondering at what cost, and also to their Western shareholders doing business now as a U.S. company, for example, in China, carries a number of risks, and watch these risks grow ahead of the Winter Olympics in China, as the focus is on allegations of human rights violations and such in China and in Xinjiang and such. And we could be in for some unsteadiness, some turbulence in the global economy if China should falter in its growth.
So now, considering all those, now let's kind of try to think a little bit more, forward-looking way. So going forward in the future, do you see the economic and the technological kind of growth that has been very impressive in this region, Asia, kind of slowing down? Or how do you think the Asia as a whole will emerge out of the current situation of characterized by the pandemic and these kind of increased risks in geopolitical factors? Any of you can start. Probably it'll be good to hear from all three panelists about kind of overall kind of outlook of the Asian business.
I'll just give you a quick answer.
Yeah, sure.
On coming out of the pandemic and growth. Looking beyond 2022, say into the medium term, I would expect many of the developing countries, especially if you get to lower middle income countries, think of like a Cambodia. I think we're going to still see high and sustained rates of growth. In the case of China, they're not going to see double-digit or close to double-digit GDP increases each year. That's definitely going to slow. Some of the maturing economies, Japan, Korea, and Singapore, already have lower growth rates. They're still growing, but not at the rate of the developing countries. But I'm generally bullish on Southeast Asia, and one could also look to South Asia. India, notwithstanding major challenges with COVID, has had high growth rates. And if it gets the policy mix right, huge potential there. So generally bullish, but with risks not limited to, say, the China-US discord, but also things like inflation, rising commodity prices. Also, if you look longer term, climate change and aging and growing inequality. These are all major challenges that present a host of policy issues before leaders in Asian countries.
I would echo that and agree. China's internal policies may be stifling growth within China. They're driving it from a government standpoint, but the fact that Ant Financial had the opportunity to bloom as one of the world's biggest financial companies, it'll be interesting to see if we can see that again in another company, and maybe in another sector. Probably not, would be my guess. And certainly Hong Kong's ability to kind of drive and help facilitate the growth is being diminished rapidly. Whereas when you look at the sectors that are growing and opportunities, and I think that's really a key here, is the opportunities for growth. It really is, less in China per se, other than, they just have a lot of people who can drive their business growth. But the opportunity certainly for innovation and development that's not tied to government funds or government direction is going to be in ASEAN. And so, particularly I would start when you're in Asia and then you come back to the US, is how some of these technologies, particularly that are being funded out of Singapore, they're probably going to transform how we do business and certainly how we operate. And that's, it's going to be a driver, not just within the region, but probably worldwide.
Thank you. So, Ravi, would you like to just add on to that and talk about what you expect in terms of opportunities or risks going forward?
Right. So in terms of opportunities, I think different kinds of businesses, industries you'll have different growth patterns and in different sort of segments. So if you look at IT-based industries, I think India is probably better positioned to take advantage of that. If you look at manufacturing, the shift from post-COVID will probably go to Southeast Asian nations because India still doesn't have the capacity or the ecosystem for manufacturing. So they're going to benefit from those things. But I think, as Bart mentioned, I think another bigger trend that's going to be a roadblock for some Asian countries is demography, right? It's really not in the favor of so many countries. For example, Japan has aged significantly. Its median age is very high. And China has aged before it's become rich, right? So at some point, this becomes a problem. And these countries don't have what in the West we have is immigration that helps resolve some of these problems. So there's absolutely no immigration in Japan. So as its median age increases, its population declines, the prospects are not very bright unless some steps are taken to sort of correct this and change the demography of the country. Same with China. So I think this demographic problems will become more visible in the next decade. And of course, the other thing is income inequality. So that's been a huge problem, less so probably in Japan, but in South Korea, in China. And there's tremendous effort to sort of get rid of these inequalities. And one way of doing that, perhaps in China, is sort of bringing state capitalism back to the front and equalizing things for the population at large. So I think demography and inequalities will be huge challenges over the next decade for most countries in Asia.
I just add one more thing. Since this session is taking place just after COP26, so leaders from around the world gathered to talk about climate change and finally agreed. It took a while that, oh yeah, maybe we should be lowering the use of coal, which is still a very important part of the energy mix in much of Asia. If we're looking at business opportunities, there's going to be, it's not limited to production, say renewable energy, but across sectors in the economy, the whole greening of economies, huge opportunities will be emerging in Asia, where there's a lot of innovation. And China itself produces a disproportionate share of the world's solar panels, as an example. But there are many innovations, some of them very indigenous, locally developed, even in poorer countries in Asia, to for example, develop circular economies, to reduce consumption, to deal with the plastics pollution problem, and to get economies onto a more sustainable, environmentally friendly path. And so I think in this space, massive opportunities, and related to the aging issue, which Ravi pointed out, connected closely to that obviously will be healthcare. So if we're looking at business opportunities, people looking for investments, sectors to consider if they're, say, a graduate student, healthcare and aged care is going to become very big business in Asia in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Okay, we might want to kind of talk a little bit more about these kind of social, cultural issues beyond just the technology and politics, because we address the demographic issues, aging population, income disparity, and so on. How about from the cultural point of view? What kind of significant cultural changes do you see at the kind of the public level beyond some of the factors, more kind of high level factors that we have talked about so far? For example, it seems the Asian economy for a long time was seen pretty much as kind of the producer, manufacturer of the world, and so on. And now I think there's a much stronger flavor in the information technology and so on. And it seems now also there are some of the kind of more softer side of Asian business that is affecting whether you're talking about the popular culture or some other world parts and so on. So I'm just wondering whether that will also present another type of new opportunity that people haven't really thought about.
Well, I just jump on that comment about entertainment very briefly. We've seen, for example, in Korea, how this has become a massive exporter of entertainment. going back to The Simpsons, the popular TV program of years before, that involves Korean creative design and thinking. You have Parasite, the Korean movie that was quite popular, and most recently, Squid Game blew Netflix numbers away as the most popular Netflix series ever. And this is kind of just tip of the iceberg stuff. You've got massive gaming going on in Asia. So these add up to not just Korea, but across Asia, multi-billion-dollar businesses. And you're finding more links between, say, Hollywood and Bollywood and other parts of Asia. You're seeing more Asian characters in films. So just the soft cultural influence of different Asian countries, some more than others, in American and Western cultures, and exports from Asia of talent, of creativity, of gaming and such. I think this is on the rise.
And following on that, COVID actually for a lot of these industries has been great, and Netflix especially, or streaming services. 3 or 4 years ago, it was really hard to find shows or movies that were produced outside of the big centers, even outside of Bollywood. But now it's you go online and you're able to watch a show that maybe was produced in the UAE or in the Philippines, and and nowadays we're used to watching things with subtitles. That's a huge sea change in how we view, the world views, a lot of the population views, looking at entertainment. And for a lot of these countries, to Bart's point, a lot of the work that's done on cartoons is done in Asia, in the Philippines and South Korea. And so it provides opportunities or channels for growth in industries that didn't exist, or existed and were very small, and now they can go to scale. Now, the ability to be able to get the funding to go to scale is a separate issue.
Thank you. Now, there's another question. This kind of sort of comment and also question coming from the audience, and it is related with the sustainability and the Southeast Asian countries. And the comment is that it seems like the main economic source in this region is still agriculture. And I think economic development has always been considered as industrialization or more urbanization and so on. But now with these Asian countries that are somewhat isolated and still very dependent on a traditional agriculture, could that be an opportunity in a different type of sustainable development rather than the traditional notion of industrialization? Do any of you have a thought on that point?
Well, I'd just say, Q, that Asia, like in other parts of the developing world, has seen a move toward the cities. So if you look at how urbanized Asia is today compared to, say, 50 years ago, people are living in cities or near cities. So now it depends. You have to speak country to country, because some still have a large share of the population living in rural areas, and employment in rural areas remains very important. So in that regard, and oftentimes the socioeconomic indicators are lower, access to services, levels of education and opportunity are lower. So attention needs to be paid to these often excluded or marginalized areas of countries. At the same time, in terms of opportunity, in terms of introducing innovations and improved productivity on the farm, there are massive opportunities there. I think of this as just a bit anecdotal, but indicates some of the thinking taking place in different places is in Laos, which, like Vietnam, produces coffee. And recognizing Laos in recent years before COVID was starting to get more and more tourists. Amazingly beautiful mountainous country, and many of these were Western tourists interested in the land and in nature and scenery, and so they were buying up organic coffee. So getting into new markets, not just subsistence farming, but looking at exporting to meet tastes in other countries internationally and to visiting tourists. There's this evolution taking place as well. Ecotourism, just as a slight springboard from there, also presents great opportunities, especially in the wake of COVID, when people seem to reconnect a bit more with nature, and we're happy to get away from others for a while. I think the attraction of nature and ecotourism and care about health and safety and connection to the environment, these are huge opportunities in the tourism space.
Okay. Thank you. All right, we are nearing the end of this webinar. So if I also give maybe Ravi and Chris kind of last kind of opportunity to kind of have your kind of closing thoughts, and then we'll close this soon. Ravi, what would be the kind of final message that you'd like to impart with the audience here?
I think if you think about economic growth, there's going to be more economic growth in Asia over the next 2 or 3 decades than one can imagine. So it behooves all of us to pay attention to that and figure out ways how US firms, businesses, investors can take advantage of that growth. But one has to do it smartly. Of course, there'll be ups and downs as no one anticipated COVID things. And again, there'll be fracture lines. So one has to manage different sides, different systems that will conflict. But in terms of growth, what happened historically, I think the reemergence is taking place, and there'll be a new equilibrium at some point. And China will probably be the largest economy in nominal GDP terms, and Asia again will be a very important continent. So it's for us to take advantage of it.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Ravi and Bart said. The only caveat I would have is from a geopolitical standpoint of keeping an eye on the situation related to Taiwan and where things are going there, because that could be a kind of a game changer, and particularly upend any growth forecast we might have. I agree completely that there's a lot of opportunities in ASEAN countries, especially, and also for New Zealand and Australia. But that kind of $64,000 question is, what is from a geopolitical standpoint, and what are we going to see going to happen with Taiwan over the next 3 years or so?
Okay. Thank you very much. Sounds like we might want to have another webinar like this to talk about it, depending upon how things develop there. Well, thank you very much. This was very thought-provoking. It was just fascinating to hear from kind of 3 different experts with 3 different areas of expertise. And thank you, audience, for your engagement. And thank you also the supporting administrative crew here to make this possible. So thank you for your time. And then we'll see you at the next webinar sponsored by Whitman School. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.